Picture a night on the northern grasslands, sometime before the railroads. Wind has been rising since sundown. By midnight, it is loud enough that you cannot hear the horses. The temperature has fallen past the point where exposed skin survives more than minutes. Somewhere on that dark grass, inside a slim cone of hide, a family is asleep. A small fire holds the center. A grandmother mends by its light. Children sleep against an inner wall. By sunrise, that home will not be there. Not because the storm took it, but because they will have taken it themselves, folded it, tied it to their horses, and moved. The ground where the walls stood will look no different from the ground beside it. Hold that image and ask the question it forces on you. What kind of shelter survives a 100-mile-per-hour prairie gale, keeps human beings alive at 40 below, and vanishes before breakfast? Most people already have an answer. Tipi, they say. A cone of skins, almost a tent. That answer is not wrong. It is just deeply incomplete. It is like calling a violin a wooden box with strings. What those poles and hides formed was not a tent. It was a machine, tuned across generations to fight 4 opponents at once. Wind, cold, its own breath, and time itself, with almost no rigid hardware. To understand how, we have to stop admiring the tipi from the outside and examine what it was doing. The engineering hiding inside its silhouette is stranger and more sophisticated than any museum caption suggests. Every building negotiates with its environment, and most fail because they solve for one variable at a time. A castle solves for attack and ignores comfort. A greenhouse solves for warmth and collapses in wind. A skyscraper solves for gravity and burns fuel to survive its own summers. The plains gave its builders no such luxury. Any shelter here had to solve 4 problems at once, and failure in any one meant failure in all. The first enemy was wind. The continent's interior has almost no windbreaks. Air masses build speed across 1,000 miles of open grass and arrive with almost geological force. A shelter that resisted wind head-on would be shredded inside a season. The second enemy was cold. Not the cold of a coastal winter, but northern nights when mercury falls off the scale, metal shatters, and breath freezes on the inside of a collar. The third enemy was more insidious. It was breath itself. Every fire, every warm body, every simmering pot releases smoke, moisture, and carbon dioxide. Trap those inside a sealed shelter and it kills you before the storm does. The fourth enemy was time, and the mismatch between human need and environmental change. Bison moved, water moved, grass moved. A structure fixed to one spot on the plains was a structure planning to lose. The tipi is the only pre-industrial shelter I know of that solved all 4 at once, with the same handful of parts, using shape and material to do the work later generations would need machines for. Take them one at a time. Start with the wind. The strongest defenses are the ones that do not look like defenses. The tipi is a monument to that idea. Its shape is often called conical, but the real form is a tilted cone. The back of the lodge is steeper and shorter. The front is longer and more open. Pitched with its steeper side facing the prevailing wind, the lodge gives the storm no flat surface to grab. Wind on the inclined skin splits. Part climbs the slope and spills over the top. Part presses downward along the surface, running down the poles and driving them into the ground. In other words, the harder the storm blows, the more firmly the tipi seats itself. The structure does not fight the wind. It converts the wind into its own anchor. The frame beneath is equally clever. It begins as a tripod, 3 poles lashed near the top and raised together. 3 points of contact are inherently stable on rough ground, in a way 4 or more are not. More poles then lean into that embrace, until a spiral lattice of 12 or 20 tapered lengths reaches into the sky. The poles are not welded or bolted. They are lashed with wet rawhide, which tightens fiercely as it dries, but keeps a small amount of flex. Under a hard gust, the whole assembly bends, absorbs the shock, and springs back. It behaves less like a building than a mast. A structure that flexes on purpose survives conditions that snap a rigid one in half. But wind was only the first of 4 enemies. Once the shell was holding, another kind of enemy had to be defeated, and this one was silent. Cold on the northern plains is not something a single layer of hide can defeat alone. Any material thin enough to carry on horseback is too thin to insulate against 40 below. So the tipi does not try. It uses a system. 3 components work together to build a warm zone inside a very cold envelope. And the trick is in how they layer. The outermost layer is the cover, a sewn membrane of prepared bison hide, whose job is to shed wind and stop water. The innermost layer is the fire at the center of the lodge, radiating heat and pushing warm air upward. Between them, hung around the interior wall, sits a component most casual observers miss: a liner, a second inner curtain of hide or cloth, running around the poles and reaching up perhaps to head height. The liner is the quiet genius of the whole design. It creates a narrow vertical gap between the outer wall and the living space. Cold air seeping in at ground level does not sweep across the floor. It is caught in that gap and pushed upward, warming slightly as it rises, joining the column of hot air from the fire, and exiting through the top. The tipi builds a chimney inside its own walls. The cold air becomes fuel for the ventilation system, rather than a threat to the sleepers. The floor stays calmer. The fire draws better. Bedding stays drier. Modern architects call this passive convective climate control, the same principle behind advanced sustainable design today, achieved centuries earlier with hide and rope. So the wind is redirected, the cold is layered. 2 enemies down, but the fire that heats the lodge is also filling it with smoke, and if smoke cannot leave, no one inside will either. At the crown of the tipi, 2 panels of the cover extend past the smoke hole. 2 long external poles hold them in place, and either can be shifted from outside. Most observers see decoration. They are looking at a control surface, and it is one of the most sophisticated pieces of low-technology engineering in North American architecture. A closed shelter with a fire inside faces a dilemma. The fire needs oxygen, so the shelter cannot be sealed, but every opening is a hole through which weather enters and heat escapes. Most cultures solved this with a rigid chimney. The plains solved it with a tunable slot at the peak of the cone, oriented against the wind by hand. When wind blows across the top of a correctly angled opening, it creates a low-pressure zone that pulls smoke upward and outward, almost like a wing-generating lift. The fire vents itself. If the wind shifts at 3 in the morning, someone steps out, adjusts the poles, and re-aims the opening. When rain moves in, the flaps can be angled to shield the interior while allowing enough draw to keep the fire alive. Set correctly, this tunable opening turns a hide structure into a working heating and cooking environment through the worst nights the continent can produce. Set wrong, it fills the interior with smoke and turns a survivable night into an ordeal. The smoke flaps may be the clearest case in the tipi of a solution that looks ornamental and is deeply functional. So the wind is used against itself. The cold is layered out. The breath of the fire is steered into the sky. 3 enemies down, but the 4th is not weather. It is the calendar itself. Most architectural traditions treat permanence as a virtue. Stone lasts, brick lasts, concrete lasts. The longer a building stands, the more the culture behind it tends to trust it. The plains flipped this assumption with clear eyes. The bison did not stay in one valley. Grazing shifted with the season. Water came and went. In an environment where the land itself was in motion, a shelter that could not move would slowly starve its occupants. So the tipi was designed for departure from the very first pole. Every element earns its place in both stillness and travel. The long poles that hold the roof become the frame of a travois when camp breaks. The cover rolls into a bundle a horse can carry without complaint. Nothing on the lodge is deadweight. Nothing exists only to look important. A skilled crew could bring a large tipi down in under an hour, load it, cross 50 miles of prairie, and raise it again by evening. When the camp moved on, the ground beneath the vanished lodge was almost exactly the ground next to it. No foundation, no timber to rot, no scar. This is not a lesser form of architecture than a stone house. It is a different theory of what a home is for. A stone house says, This place belongs to me. A tipi says, I am passing through, and I will honor this place enough not to break it. In an age when we are only now waking up to the environmental cost of permanent buildings, that older philosophy has begun to look startlingly modern. But before we congratulate ourselves for rediscovering it, we should remember who kept it alive, and how much of the intelligence behind the tipi never appears in traditional histories of engineering. Wood in the wind is only wood. What made the tipi possible was what wrapped around it, and that wrapping was a technology as sophisticated as any in the pre-industrial world. It just did not happen in a factory. It happened in the hands of women. Preparing a bison hide for a lodge cover was not craft in the decorative sense. It was material science. A raw hide is heavy, biologically unstable, and useless as architecture. To become a working weather membrane, it had to be scraped, softened, and chemically treated. In many traditions, hides were brain-tanned. The natural oils of the animal worked into the fibers to change how they responded to moisture and cold. In others, they were smoke-cured, hung over slow, cool fires until the molecular behavior of the material changed. The goal was not merely preservation. It was performance. A finished cover had to shed rain without soaking, stay flexible in temperatures that would freeze untreated hide solid, survive being packed and re-erected hundreds of times, and accept patching for years. Often, more than a dozen hides were sewn into one enormous piece, cut to a specific curved geometry, so that under the tension of a raised frame it sat smoothly, met cleanly at the door, and rose into the flaps at the top. Every seam was placed to distribute stress. Every stitch carried load. This work has traditionally been called craft. That word does the workers no favors. The women who tanned hides and built lodge covers were doing structural material engineering, using biological chemistry the modern world would not formalize for another century. Without their knowledge, the whole system falls apart. With it, a pile of poles and skins becomes a climate-tuned home. The categories mainstream history uses to judge intelligence are narrower than most of us realize. Written mathematics counts. Oral instruction does not. Steel counts. Bone and sinew do not. Laboratories count. Camp circles do not. Applied to the tipi, these categories generate a strange verdict. Ingenious, the story goes, but not truly technological. That verdict is not just condescending. It is analytically wrong. The people who designed and refined plains lodges understood pressure gradients, load paths, thermal convection, material fatigue, and passive climate control. They did not use the equations a European engineer would use, but they solved the same problems under harsher constraints, with tighter feedback loops. Their designs were tested by winters that killed anything that failed. There is no more rigorous peer review than that. The knowledge that survived was what worked. It was carried through language, ceremony, hands-on training, and patient education of the next generation. Distributed across gender roles the outside world often failed to notice, with women holding as much technical mastery as men in different domains. When settler expansion disrupted the conditions in which that knowledge lived, an enormous amount of applied science was lost, buried, or reclassified as folklore. Recognizing the tipi as engineering is not sentimental, it is corrective. It opens the possibility that other traditions of knowledge, still living in indigenous communities and elsewhere, carry answers to problems industrial civilization is only now beginning to notice. If we could miss the sophistication of the tipi for so long, what else are we missing right now? Return to the opening image, a family sleeping on the northern grass, a storm the temperature of death itself moving past the walls, a small fire holding the center. By morning, no trace. What does that shelter know that we do not? It knows shape can do the work of mass. A tilted cone redirects forces a straight wall cannot survive. It knows flexibility is a form of strength. Rigid structures snap under stress. A breathing frame absorbs. It knows that materials are not neutral. A prepared hide performs work raw hide cannot approach. It knows that openings can be tuned. A fixed hole is a vulnerability. A steerable one is a control system. It knows layers create climate. Two thin surfaces with a managed gap between them can outperform a single thick wall. It knows mobility is not a compromise. A house that can leave when the land needs it to leave is not a lesser house. It is a wiser one, and it knows something we are only just relearning. Comfort does not have to come at the cost of the ground beneath you. Permanence is not the same as care. The Tipi cared for its people without breaking the earth it stood on. Very few of the buildings we live in now can say the same. Every question modern sustainable architecture is trying to answer, the Tipi answered centuries ago. Without fossil fuels, without manufactured insulation, without truckloads of hardware, and without a scar. Not because its builders could not build something heavier, because they understood something we forgot. A house is not a monument. A house is an instrument for living inside a world that will always be larger than you. The best instruments do not shout. They tune themselves to the music already playing. If films like this one interest you, subscribe. The past has more to teach us than we have been ready to hear.